Imagine this. You're sitting on an airplane cruising at 41,000 feet. Just kick back, looking forward to landing in Edmonton, Alberta. You're about halfway through a very routine flight, and suddenly, without warning, one engine stops running. And then, the second one stops. A complete eerie silence fills the cabin. Then you start to realize things are a little bit off. No power, no thrust, and no fuel. Just a giant Boeing 767 gliding through the air. And it makes you wonder, how far can a 767 glide without any power? This might sound like the script of a disaster movie, but it's real life. And now to make it worse, you're over a remote part of Canada. I mean, let's be honest, most of Canada is remote, but this specifically is over Manitoba. Now all you can do is pray that the pilot has a plan. Welcome to Lost Flights, where we dive into aviation incidents and miracles that you might not have heard of, but ones that change the way we fly today, making sure that you and I arrive safely. I'm your host, Trevor, and today we're exploring the remarkable story of human error, poor systems, luck, and a whole lot of pilot skill, expertise, and knowledge of the area. The Gimli glider. Now, I want to picture yourself in 1983. Air travel was so different back then. It was pre-9/11, so no endless security lines, no digital boarding passes, but flying was a completely different experience back then. It was something special for people to do. You could still get a hot quality meal on board, and people actually dressed up for flights. The cabin had a certain buzz to it, a feeling that you were part of something special, something almost glamorous, because it was back then. And let's be honest, it is not that today. Flying is far from that today, unless you spend tens of thousands of dollars on first or business class. I mean, let's be honest. This was also a time of rapid innovation. The aviation industry was transforming, evolving from the golden age of aviation into a new era of technology and efficiency. At the forefront of this change was the Boeing 767, a brand new airliner in 1983, one of the first to integrate advanced computer systems into the cockpit. The 767 was designed to set a new standard, featuring a two-man cockpit, which meant that the flight engineer was no longer needed, and the aircraft systems were monitoring and managing everything. The introduction of computerized controls and an electronic cockpit meant that pilots now had an extra set of eyes, even though they had some before, on nearly every detail of the flight. Fuel level, altitude, speed, and even the health of the engines. Everything was displayed digitally right on screens in front of them. It was sleek, it was streamlined, and it was highly efficient. And yet, as impressive as it was, this new technology came with its own set of challenges. One of the biggest shifts at this time was moving from the imperial measurement system, pounds, gallons, miles, to the metric system. Suddenly, pilots and ground crews were working in kilograms, liters, and kilometers, a change that was meant to bring global standard to aviation. But it wasn't easy. For pilots and crews who'd spent years working with one system, this new way of calculating fuel, weight, and distance was a learning curve, and it didn't always go smoothly. With all this new technology, there was also a sense of growing pains within the industry. Computers were supposed to be flawless, infallible, yet there was still an underlying tension. Would the pilots be able to adapt quickly enough? Could they trust these new systems? And what would happen if something went wrong? The excitement over the future of aviation was tempered by these questions, and every flight on one of these modern airliners felt like a step into uncharted territory for some people. Against this backdrop of excitement and uncertainty, Air Canada Flight 133 took off on a summer day in 1983, carrying its passengers and crew on what they believed would be an ordinary, routine journey from Montreal to Edmonton, Alberta. But a combination of new technology and human error would soon turn that routine journey into one of the most extraordinary events in aviation history. Truly. At the heart of what went wrong on Flight 143 was a tiny mathematical misstep that had massive consequences. Air Canada, like much of the aviation industry at the time, was in the middle of this transition from imperial system to metric. Imagine you've been using one system your whole life, and then all of a sudden, you're forced to use another one almost overnight. Now, on July 23, 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 was set to fly from Montreal, Quebec to Edmonton, Alberta, with a short stopover in Ottawa. The ground crew prepared the plane following the new protocols. But during the refueling process, a crucial mistake was made. They calculated the amount of fuel in pounds instead of kilograms. They thought they had filled the plane's tanks with over 20,000 kilograms of fuel, but in reality, they had only filled a little bit over half of that amount. To put this into perspective for you, think of it like trying to fill a swimming pool with gallons instead of liters. You think you've got enough, but when you're halfway through, you realize you're running out of water. The mistake wasn't caught because to the crew, everything looked as it should. The numbers all seemed right until they ran out of fuel. Now here's the kicker. This type of conversion mistake isn't as rare as you think it might be. We've all made simple calculation errors. Maybe you've tried to convert dollars to another currency on a trip and accidentally miscalculated. Or you've tried doubling a recipe and ended up with too much salt or too much sugar. I know I've done that. But on an aircraft, even a small miscalculation can turn a routine flight into a disastrous situation, putting lives at risk. Salty cookies aren't going to put lives at risk, hopefully. As the crew prepared for takeoff, they thought everything was ready and totally fine. Captain Robert Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal were seasoned pilots, and they knew their aircraft well. Typically, they would rely on a plane's electronic fuel gauge to verify the amount of fuel. But on this particular day, another kicker here, the fuel gauges weren't working. A technical glitch had left them blank, with no numbers to confirm the fuel level. Yep, this is all going the right direction. You can already see it. This wasn't an ideal situation, but it also wasn't that uncommon. When gauges malfunctioned, the crew had a backup method. They calculated the fuel manually, and that's exactly what they did. Using the fuel amount they believed had been loaded, the crew manually checked their figures, trusting the numbers provided by the ground crew, which they should. I mean, there's no problem with doing that. You should trust these guys. With their manual calculations done and confirmed, the crew felt a sense of confidence as they completed their pre-flight checks. Everything seemed normal, and to them, all systems were go. There was no sign of the error lurking beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself at 41,000 feet. So with passengers seated and all systems ready, Flight 143 lifted off, leaving Montreal for Ottawa, and eventually on to Edmonton. Unaware of the crisis that was quietly building with every passing mile. This is a reminder of how easily even the most experienced pilots and professionals can fall into a trap of trusting the numbers, trusting the system without knowing an error had been made. In this case, it wasn't a glaring mistake, but a quiet hidden error, a mistake hiding in the decimals, that would soon send Flight 143 gliding through the sky of Manitoba without a single drop of fuel. Not long into the flight, they reached their cruising altitude over Red Lake, Ontario, a remote area surrounded by endless stretches of dense forest and sparkling lakes. It's beautiful there. The cabin was calm and the passengers were relaxed, as they should be. I would be. Up in the cockpit, Pearson and Quintal were settling into the long cruise portion of their flight, the part that pilots call the boring bit. Straight and level flight at 41,000 feet. But then, a small light started blinking on the instrument panel. A fuel pressure warning. Now, warnings like this aren't necessarily uncommon. The crew had seen these before. It's easy to assume that it's just a faulty sensor, especially on a newer aircraft with complex systems that could occasionally throw out false alarms. They treated it as they would any other system glitch, making note of it for further checks when they landed. But before they could settle back in, another fuel pressure light came on. This time, it was on the other side of the aircraft. Still, they weren't panicking. There were backup systems for nearly everything on this aircraft, but within moments, things escalated quickly. Suddenly, the left engine cut out. The massive 767, one of the most advanced jets of its time, lost power on one side. Now, normally, this isn't too much of a problem because most planes can fly on one engine and be totally fine. They're built to do that. The reality sank in, though. This wasn't just a faulty light or a sensor error. Something was seriously wrong. In the cockpit, Pearson and Quintal quickly sprang into action. They knew that losing one engine was manageable, like I just said. The 767 was designed to fly safely on a single engine. They went through their checklist, remaining calm and focused. But then, without warning, the second engine sputtered out. A wave of realization hit. This was no longer just a simple mechanical issue. They were out of fuel. And both engines were gone. With the second engine gone, an eerie silence took over. Imagine the quiet that follows when your car engine shuts off. Now imagine that, but you're at 41,000 feet above the ground, with only the faint whistle of the wind against the fuselage as your soundtrack. The silence was overwhelming. The massive 767, weighing over 300,000 pounds, had suddenly become a glider, an incredibly heavy glider. Inside the cockpit, Pearson and Quintal understood the gravity of the situation. They had lost all engine power, which meant they'd also lost primary hydraulic and electrical systems. Then the instrument panel went dark, leaving only a handful of backup instruments that ran on minimal battery power. In that silence, the reality of their task began to sink in. They would have to glide this enormous aircraft with no thrust and limited control to the nearest place they could find. But where would that be? They're over a remote area of Manitoba, Canada. A 767 isn't designed to glide, but every plane has a glide ratio, a balance between how far forward it will travel for every foot it falls. In the 767, that glide ratio is roughly 12:1, meaning they could travel 12 miles forward for every mile of descent, which isn't much, but it is something at this point. They would have to make every mile count, hoping they'd have enough altitude and distance to find somewhere safe to land. Even with years of experience and training, the odds felt almost impossible. The only instruments they had were a basic attitude indicator, an altimeter, and a compass. It was as if they were flying blind. Pearson and Quintal were left with nothing but their instincts and their training as they began to descend through the skies over Manitoba. It would take every ounce of skill they had and possibly a miracle to get Flight 143 safely on the ground. Now, Pearson was no ordinary pilot. Alongside his extensive training as an airline pilot, he was also a skilled glider pilot. And while gliding isn't something you usually practice at the controls of a 767, today his unexpected experience was about to make all the difference. Glider pilots develop a unique skill set. Without engines to rely on, every decision counts. Gliding teaches you to use altitude as your fuel, to manage every turn, every descent with precision, knowing that once you start descending, there's no way to regain that altitude. Pearson had spent countless hours in these small, engineless planes practicing this delicate balance. Now, at 41,000 feet with 69 lives depending on him, Pearson's mind went into glider mode. He quickly calculated his options, knowing that every second spent thinking was a second lost. He'd have to carefully monitor the plane's descent rate, keeping their speed in check while maintaining a shallow enough angle to stretch out their glide as far as possible. Pearson's years in the glider cockpit gave him an instinctive sense of how the aircraft would respond without engines. He understood the power of gravity and airflow, relying on his intuition to coax the 767 again, over 300,000 pounds of metal, fuel, and people, to keep moving forward, inching towards safety. Meanwhile, First Officer Quintal was scanning the cockpit, assessing every option they had. As Pearson concentrated on flying, Quintal took on the critical task of finding a place to land, a decision that would mean the difference between survival and disaster. He rifled through maps, searching for anything nearby that could serve as an emergency runway. And then he remembered someplace from his past. Quintal's mind flashed back to a long-abandoned Air Force base in Gimli, a small town in Manitoba. It had been years since he'd flown there, but he knew it had a long enough runway, designed for military planes, that was just within their reach. The decision was made. Gimli was their target. But there was one thing that Quintal and Pearson didn't know. Since its closure as a military base, Gimli had been converted into a racetrack. And on this particular day, a crowd gathered to watch a car race on the very runway that they were gliding toward. Imagine these stakes, descending and aiming for a runway that was now being used for car racing. Quintal's memory of Gimli gave them the fighting chance, but they were about to find out that their destination was far from empty. Still, in that moment, there was no other option. They committed to Gimli, trusting that this unexpected runway would offer them a slim margin of hope. With Gimli set as their target, Pearson and Quintal faced the extraordinary challenge, gliding over 80 miles without any power. They had to manage their altitude, direction, and speed with such precision that even the smallest mistake could bring them down too early. In a commercial airliner, gliding such a distance was almost unheard of. They had no engines to help maintain altitude or anything to really slow their descent, only the natural glide of the aircraft. Every second counted. Pearson kept a close eye on the limited instruments they had left, calculating every mile, making constant adjustments to keep their descent as shallow as possible. The goal was to stretch out their glide ratio, to squeeze every mile out of every foot of altitude. At one point, they calculated that it would be close, almost too close. But with each small adjustment, they inched closer and closer to Gimli. Could you imagine the tension in the cockpit? With the silence only broken by Quintal's updates on their position and Pearson's calls for their altitude? This was a test of nerves and skill, pushing both men to their absolute limits. They were aiming for a runway that might as well be a thin thread on the horizon, each mile drawing them closer or further from that lifeline. With the runway finally in sight, Pearson and Quintal could only hope that the altitude they had was enough to get there. There was no backup plan and no other options at this point. They were locked into their descent, praying that they would reach Gimli before the Earth rushed up to meet them. The crew and passengers had no idea what lay ahead, but Pearson and Quintal knew that this landing would be like nothing they'd ever faced before. With Gimli now in sight, Pearson and Quintal prepared for the most critical part of their journey, the landing. Without engines, they had lost the power required to lower the landing gear. All they had was gravity and a hand-cranked manual hydraulic system, a last resort that would hopefully coax the wheels down in time. As Pearson and Quintal worked to prepare the plane, the tension was thick, every movement measured, every second valuable. They engaged the manual hydraulic system, waiting anxiously as the landing gear began to creak into position. But then, another complication arose. The nose gear hadn't fully deployed. With limited control, they could do nothing to fix it. The 767 was coming in hot, with the rear landing gear barely in place and the nose gear locked halfway up. So at this point, they were flying blind in more ways than one, unable to predict what was going to happen when they actually touched the ground. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers began to realize how grave this situation was. Could you imagine that? If you were a passenger on this plane and all of a sudden you realize that engines go out, it's really quiet, then you're descending very quickly, and then you see the ground coming up quickly and it's not your destination. And yeah, that would be pretty nerve-wracking. They had felt the engines cut out a while ago, and now, like I said, they saw the ground approaching really fast. Flight attendants instructed everyone to brace for impact. As soon as I heard that, if I was on that plane and I heard that, I'm not sure what I would do. I haven't been in this situation, but I would be probably pretty stressed. And a heavy silence settled as the passengers locked eyes with each other, gripping their armrest, awaiting whatever came next. Meanwhile, down on the runway at Gimli, people were gathered for a very different reason. A drag racing event. As I mentioned, the runway had been converted into a racetrack, and spectators filled the area. Expecting to watch cars race down the strip, not a commercial airliner attempting an emergency landing. Out of nowhere, they saw it. A massive plane descending silently, gliding toward them without any sound. Without the roar of the engines, it seemed almost surreal, as if the plane was falling from the sky, because it kind of was. People on the ground stood frozen in shock. Some spectators ran, while others just looked on, unable to process what they were actually seeing. A plane of that size doesn't just glide quietly. It doesn't appear out of nowhere. But here it was. Air Canada Flight 143, descending toward the racetrack in what seemed like slow motion, ready to make impact with or without their understanding of the sheer scale of the danger. When Flight 143 finally made contact with the runway, it was anything but gentle. Without the nose gear fully down, the front of the plane dipped and the nose scraped along the asphalt, sending a shower of sparks flying. The weight of the aircraft bore down on the runway, and Pearson fought with everything he had to keep the plane straight, to stop it from veering off into the crowded area just beyond the strip. The cockpit was filled with the deafening roar of metal grinding against the ground and the smell of burning rubber and sparks filling the air as Pearson and Quintal struggled to bring the aircraft to a stop. The passengers were jolted and jarred, clutching their seats as the aircraft's massive body skidded across the runway, barely under control. And then, finally, the plane came to a stop. A heavy silence fell over the cockpit and the cabin as passengers took in the realization they had survived. Against all odds, Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal had managed to bring the powerless plane to the ground without a single fatality. They pulled off the impossible. As emergency crews rushed toward the aircraft, the passengers and crew began to make their way out, grateful, shocked, and shaken. Rightfully so. What they didn't know was their survival had come down to a series of small decisions, a stroke of luck, and the skill of two pilots who had defied the odds. The Gimli glider had landed, and everyone had walked away with their lives. That's just incredible. To truly understand the tension of Flight 143 that day, we need to step into the shoes of the passengers. Imagine being seated in that cabin. One moment you're cruising comfortably at 41,000 feet, maybe enjoying a book, maybe just staring out the window. And then everything changes. The lights flicker, the comforting hum of the engines disappears, and suddenly, silence takes over. You realize the plane is eerily quiet, like a massive bird just drifting through the sky. At first, there was confusion. People glanced at each other, unsure if this was some sort of routine issue that the pilots had under control. But as the minutes passed and the silence continued, anxiety crept in. Rightfully so. Flight attendants began walking the aisles, instructing everyone to take a brace position and prepare for an emergency landing. The words hit with a chilling realization. Something was deeply and dangerously wrong. In those final moments, as the ground drew closer, passengers clung to their armrests and whispered prayers, some closing their eyes, others watching with a sense of helplessness as they approached the runway. And then, impact. The plane jolted, metal screeched against the ground, and sparks flew as the aircraft nose scraped along the runway. Every bump, every skid felt like it could be the end. And then somehow, the plane stopped. The jarring movements ended, and there was nothing but silence once again. But this time, a thankful silence. The realization had set in. They were alive, and every passenger on board had survived. A mix of shock, relief, and gratitude swept through the cabin as they unbuckled and helped each other gather their belongings. As they exited the plane, passengers looked back at the 767, now still and scarred, a testament to the incredible skill of the crew and the miracle they had just experienced. After the dust had settled and the passengers were safely off the aircraft, investigators began piecing together what had gone wrong. The incident was highly unusual. A modern, sophisticated aircraft like the Boeing 767 simply running out of fuel was almost unthinkable. But as the investigators delved into the details, a series of small critical errors came to light. The root of the problem was traced back to a simple metric conversion error. When the aircraft was fueled, the ground crew used pounds instead of kilograms to measure the fuel quantity. It sounds trivial, but in aviation, precision is everything. Because of this miscalculation, the 767 was loaded with just over half the fuel it actually needed for the journey. And with no functioning fuel gauges in the cockpit that day, the crew had no way to verify the amount manually. Investigators found this wasn't just a one-off mistake. It was part of a broader issue with the metric transition in the aviation industry. Air Canada, like many other airlines at the time, were still trying to adjust to this switch from imperial to metric, and the training and protocols hadn't fully caught up yet. This oversight set the stage for the events of Flight 143. The final report highlighted these conversion errors and the need for fail-safes in fuel monitoring and calculation procedures, underscoring the importance of triple-checking such vital details. Flight 143, the Gimli glider, became more than just an aviation incident. It became a powerful case study, a lesson in both aviation safety and the resilience of human spirit. To this day, the story of the Gimli glider is taught in aviation schools around the world. Pilots study Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal's actions as examples of quick thinking, skill, and calm under pressure. The legacy of the Gimli glider led to significant changes in the industry. Following the incident, Air Canada updated its fuel management protocols, ensuring that such an error would be nearly impossible to repeat. They implemented rigorous metric training and added multiple layers of redundancy to fuel measurements and monitoring systems. But the Gimli glider's influence didn't stop with Air Canada. Its impact resonated globally. This story is often shared as a reminder of what aviation crews are trained for. They train not just for the routine, but for the unimaginable, for situations that test every ounce of skill and calmness they possess. Pearson and Quintal's actions in the skies over Manitoba that day exemplify the importance of preparation, the critical value of experience, and the profound human instinct to survive. Because of them, hundreds of pilots have gone on to learn from their story, carrying forward the lessons of the Gimli glider to ensure that passengers worldwide can feel safer in the skies. Today, the Gimli glider is legendary, a testament to how a series of small errors led to an extraordinary display of human endurance. It's a reminder that even in the most controlled environments, things can still go wrong. And when they do, it's the strength, skill, training, and determination of those in control that truly make the difference. The story of the Gimli glider is more than just a near disaster. It's a sobering reminder of the fragility of human systems. When we look at aviation, it's easy to marvel at the technology and the power of the machines like the 767 and the layers of safety measures. But at the end of the day, even the most sophisticated systems are operated and maintained by people. People who can, on rare occasion, and do, make mistakes. Because of their heroism, 69 people walked away with their lives that day. Their actions serve as a testament to the power of experience, the value of preparation, and the indomitable human drive to survive. The legacy of the Gimli glider reminds us that while we can't always prevent mistakes, we can train ourselves to respond in ways that will save lives. Next time on Lost Flights, we'll be heading into the Alaskan wilderness to explore another extraordinary aviation story, one where survival wasn't guaranteed and rescue almost seemed impossible. This is a tale of isolation, bravery, and the extremes that nature can throw at us. You don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for listening to Lost Flights. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your fellow aviation enthusiasts. And don't forget to join us next time as we continue to explore the remarkable stories that have shaped the skies.